Okay, so I promised this last week. We're going to be talking about the quadratic equation. Now, the quadratic equation is one really useful. It allows us to solve for squares. And it allows us to solve for squares when the squares aren't perfect. Perfect squares, if you remember, numbers like 4, 16, 25, 100, things that are you can square root and get a whole number. So when we have a quadratic equation, it looks like this. Oh, wrong page. And a is the coefficient of x squared. B is whatever number's in front of the x, the coefficient of the x, and c is the constant because it remains there all by its lonesome regardless of what x is doing. Okay, so it's constant. Now, so what we're going to do is, I don't know if you guys remember completing the square, but what we're going to do is we're going to walk through completing the square with this equation. So we're going to start off by just writing it in lowercase letters because it's easier to deal with. And we're going to divide by a. And the reason why is our goal here is to get x by itself on one part. So now that we've got that x squared, we're all by itself with a 1 as its coefficient. We're on our way to moving it. So we have x squared plus b over a, x plus c over a. So to complete the square, we want to subtract c over a from both sides. And that's going to give us that. X squared plus b over ax equals negative c over a. So then what we mean by completing the square is we fill in that spot right there. We're going to fill in that spot right there so it is a perfect square on the left-hand side. Now, if you remember how we went over binomial theorem there, so we had, remember, when we squared things, we ended up with a squared plus 2ab plus b squared. So we know that middle piece needs to be 2 times something. So what we're going to actually do is we are going to divide it by half and then square it. We end up with b squared over 4a squared. So what we do then is we add that to both sides. So we end up with x squared plus 2 over b over 2a plus b squared over 4a squared equals negative c over a plus b squared over 4a squared. So our next step is going to be to try and straighten up that left-handed side. So the next step we need to do is add those two fractions together. Whoop. So we have, what we're going to do is we're going to take that negative c over a, and we're going to multiply it by 4a over 4a. And that's going to give us that common denominator of 4a squared. So now we have, over on the left-hand side, we have that perfect square of x plus b over 2a squared equals, and then on our left-hand side, we have negative 4ac over 4a squared. Plus b squared over 4a squared. We add those together. We get b squared minus 4ac over 4a squared. Now our next step, so we're down to 1x. We've only got that 1x left because in completing the square, we are able to put the x squared and the x together, basically. So we then square root both sides, and we have x plus b over 2a equals plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac over the square root of 4a squared. Well, 4a squared is a perfect square. So we have x plus b over 2a equals plus or minus b squared minus 4ac over 2a. Subtract negative b over 2a from both sides, and we get the quadratic equation. So instead of having to go through and work through the completing the square, the quadratic formula allows us to solve every single quadratic equation there is. Now, sometimes if you're really good at factoring or you can just see it, it's easier to do it that way. But the reason that I like this is it not almost always, it always gives you the right answer. And if you aren't good at factoring, trying to sit there and find the factor pairs and everything, or working through completing the square can be insanely difficult. So that's it.